Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. Thank you so much for coming back to listen to more of Blemished Beauty. If you would like to follow Brenda's Books online, I am on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Today we will be continuing with Blemished Beauty, obviously, on chapter 23. And just to give you all fair warning, this chapter does have some implications of a difficult subject. So if you are a teen or a tween, I would advise you to have your trusted adult listen to it first so you can have a conversation and then proceed however you see fit. It's totally clean. As you can probably tell by the rest of the book, it's going to be clean, but the subject is difficult. So anyway, just wanted to give you a fair warning about that. Without further ado, let's continue. Chapter 23, Skin Deep. The sun was hot. Daphne opened her eyes and squinted in the bright summer light streaming through her bedroom window. She had definitely overslept. Daphne reached out to pull back the blanket covering her alarm clock. 10:30 a.m. Daphne stretched and yawned and then sat up a bit to see if Laurel were still sleeping. Laurel was gone. She'd even made her bed already. Daphne slowly slid her legs out of the covers and planted her feet on the floor. Her body was so stiff it felt like she had been in bed for days. Finally, she shuffled out the door, down the hallway, and into the living room where the party had been. She found Laurel up and dressed and tossing bottles and soda cans into a large black garbage bag. "Morning," Laurel said without looking up. "Hey," Daphne said, rubbing her eyes. "I can't believe you're up already. You went to bed a lot later than I did." "I know," said Laurel as she continued to pick up more trash. "I couldn't sleep." "Where's everybody else?" asked Daphne. "You mean our roommates?" "Yeah," said Daphne, yawning again. "They're dead asleep. I doubt we'll see any of them before noon." Daphne nodded lazily. "Well, why don't you take a break and we'll get some breakfast?" "I already ate," said Laurel curtly, as she continued to walk around and drop random things into the plastic trash bag. Laurel was still not looking at her, and was definitely not her giddy self as she usually was the day after a party. "Is there something wrong?" Daphne asked. "Yes," she said, still moving quickly. Daphne paused for a moment, waiting for Laurel to continue, but she never did. "What is it?" Daphne asked. Laurel shrugged, still making her rounds. "I am not used to feeling this way." This was going to be harder than Daphne thought. Laurel was usually pretty open with her. Daphne slowly walked towards Laurel, collecting some trash on the way. "Well, how are you feeling?" Laurel shrugged again. "Awful," she said, choking on the word. Daphne stood straight up and looked at Laurel, until Laurel stopped in her place and looked back. "Did something happen last night?" Daphne asked carefully. Laurel nodded. Daphne waited for her to continue. Laurel looked down at the garbage sack as she spoke a little forcefully. "Well, at first I was mad David liked you instead of me." She turned to Daphne and smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry for that." "I didn't know you liked him, Laurel." For some reason, Daphne felt the need to defend herself. "At least not until after—" "Well, I don't anymore," Laurel interjected sourly. "Not after last night." "What do you mean?" Daphne questioned warily. "After you went to bed, he and his friends were being so gross." "Gross as in they were belching, or—" "No!" Laurel exclaimed, shaking the bag. She sounded irritated. Her voice was shaky when she continued. "They were gross to me, like... They were..." Laurel shook her head, put one hand over her mouth, and started to sob. "Laurel!" Daphne cried in surprise. Immediately she walked over and hugged her friend. Laurel buried her face in Daphne's shoulder. "They were so awful, Daphne. So awful." Daphne was at a loss for words. "David, too?" Laurel nodded into her shoulder. Daphne took a deep breath, but instantly jumped at a sudden knock at the door. "I'll get it," she offered. Laurel stepped back and wiped her eyes. Daphne felt a little embarrassed to be answering the door in her pajamas and disheveled hair. And to make her humiliation even worse, there stood the most handsome man alive, David DeLute. Daphne couldn't help but blink and gape for a moment. David stood behind the threshold, smiling shyly. "Hi, Daphne." "Hi," was all she could say. "May I come in?" he asked. Daphne deliberated. She still was unclear about a lot of things concerning the man in front of her, especially considering what Laurel had just revealed. David looked like he was worried or concerned. "Never mind. I understand if you don't want me to. I just came to apologize." "You need to do a lot more than that!" yelled Laurel from inside the room. Daphne's eyes bulged in surprise, but she didn't turn around. It wasn't very often Laurel yelled, especially at a cute guy. David's face turned dark red and full of shame. "I came to apologize to you too, Laurel," David said a little louder. "You can apologize to the police when I report you," Laurel yelled again. David clenched his teeth together. "May I please come in?" he whispered to Daphne. Daphne scrutinized him a little more. He did look sorry. Daphne wished she knew exactly how bad it had gotten last night. "Are you sober?" she questioned him. David sighed and nodded. "Do you usually get that drunk?" David shook his head emphatically. "I promise I don't. I'm so sorry, Daphne. I was just so mad." Daphne raised an eyebrow. "Mad at what?" David swallowed hard, looking more embarrassed by the minute. "I was mad at your friend Tom." Daphne folded her arms across her chest and leaned against the threshold, giving him a challenging look. "Losing a silly arm wrestle hurts your pride so much you have to get wasted a minute later?" David sighed again. "That's not the only reason." "What other reason is there?" "Because..." David turned his head to look down the hall and then back to Daphne. "Because he likes you. And I like you too," he said solemnly. Daphne shifted in place a bit. "I thought you liked competitions." David smiled a little at that. "I do, but..." He sighed again. "I don't know what else to say except I'm sorry, Daphne. I really am." Daphne studied him a moment longer. He did look sincere. Daphne exhaled slowly and relaxed her snooty stance. David recognized her barrier coming down. "May I please come in now? I should apologize to Laurel, too." "You can come in if you promise to tell me what happened later," said Daphne in a quiet voice. David nodded solemnly. "I promise." Daphne opened the door wider and let him glide past her. They both glanced around for Laurel and eventually found her at the far end of the room, looking out the full-length window with her back to them. "You can skip it, David," Laurel said sternly. "I never want to see your face again." Daphne was surprised at Laurel's forcefulness. David took a step towards her so his toes were touching the carpet that led into the living room. He stopped right there. "Laurel, I am so sorry. I cannot tell you how sorry I am. I was drunk and..." "Yeah, I noticed," Laurel interrupted. Daphne was growing more uncomfortable with this, so she decided to sit down at the kitchen table. "I didn't know what I was doing," David continued. Daphne rolled her eyes, but David didn't see. "What did you do, David?" Daphne wondered out loud. David turned to face her quickly. "I didn't do anything. It was just what I said," David explained. "And what I said was so wrong, Laurel. So wrong," he confessed, turning back to Laurel, who was still looking out the window. No one spoke for a long moment. "Laurel, these other guys were saying stuff about a bunch of girls, and in my drunken stupor I was just repeating what they said. I don't even remember what half of it was." Daphne rolled her eyes again, and Laurel scoffed but didn't turn around. "Laurel, do you believe me?" David asked. Laurel waved a dismissive arm at him. "Sure, whatever." David sighed and stepped closer to Daphne. "Please forgive me for this," he whispered. "Can I see you later today?" "I don't think that's such a good idea, David," Daphne said. David rolled his head. "Oh, come on. I made a mistake and I'm apologizing. What else can I do?" Daphne shrugged. "Nothing, I guess. But I don't think you and I need to be spending time together anymore." David walked around the table and leaned in towards her. "Daphne, please don't do this to me. You know I really like you." Those gorgeous blue eyes were staring at her, pleading. In that brief moment, Daphne began to reason with herself. Laurel usually lets guys say really, really stupid things to her, and somehow is always okay with it. She's never been upset like this before. Daphne was beginning to believe Tom had been right. Maybe this very attractive man was dangerous. "You don't even know me, David," Daphne noted. "I want to get to know you better," David pressed. Daphne looked into his eyes again. They were certainly beautiful, but something was missing underneath. No light was in them, just bleakness. "I'm sorry," Daphne apologized, "but we need to go our separate ways." Shock flooded David's eyes, and Daphne sensed a wave of resentment as bitterness swept over his face. "I'm not giving up on you," he whispered, but the whisper sounded more like a threat than a promise. Daphne felt chills run down her spine as David DeLute spun around and aggressively walked out the door. Tom was restless. He had been walking around the park for over an hour now. He wanted to go see Daphne, but wasn't sure if it was a good time. Then he saw her, as if fate had planned it, sitting on a park bench a few feet ahead of him. She was sitting with Laurel. They appeared to be having a very serious conversation. Tom instantly wanted to jet out of there as fast as he could, but he also wanted to join them. At that moment, Daphne looked up and saw him staring at them. She looked surprised to see him, but not angry. Tom would count that as a good thing. Laurel turned around too. Tom was shocked when he saw her face. She had obviously been crying hard. Tom involuntarily took a step back. Now would probably be a good time to retreat. He certainly didn't want to interrupt whatever this was. Daphne stunned him by motioning him to come over to them. He threw her a questioning look, but that only encouraged her further. "Come here!" she called. Hesitantly, Tom took a few steps and closed the large space between them. Tom had no idea what to say, so he was grateful when Daphne spoke first. "Tom, would you help us with something?" she asked. "Sure," said Tom. He glanced at Laurel. What happened?" Laurel didn't speak but just continued to sob. He turned to Daphne for an explanation. "It's a long story," explained Daphne. "We were wondering if you would write a report to the police for us as an additional witness?" Tom's jaw dropped. "Witness to what?" "I don't want to be here for this," Laurel admitted. "You can tell him without me." "Are you going back home?" asked Daphne. Laurel nodded, and the two girls leaned in and gave each other a warm hug. "Everything's going to be okay," Daphne assured her. "Thanks," said Laurel, sniffling. Without another word, she scurried off past the large pine that led into the quiet street. "I didn't mean to interrupt you two," Tom told her. "Not to worry," said Daphne, patting the bench beside her. She began speaking with urgency before Tom even sat down. "Tom, I am so sorry for what I said to you last night. I was really, really wrong. I only said it because, well, never mind. I hope you're not still mad at me," Daphne said. She gazed at him with a sincere, imploring look. It almost made Tom's heart stop. Tom shook his head. "I shouldn't have challenged DeLute, but my ego got the better of me." "No, DeLute's ego got the better of him," Daphne countered. Tom leaned forward and put his elbows on his knees as he looked at Daphne. "What did that devil do?" "What do you mean? What happened?" "He got drunk last night and turned into an entirely different person. I could blame it all on you if I were foolishly in love with him," Daphne said, but then she flashed Tom a smile to let him know she wasn't. "Now what in the world could I have done to have merited that blame?" Tom asked playfully, unconsciously moving closer to her. "You beat him in an arm wrestling contest," Daphne said matter-of-factly. "That obviously hurt his pride." "Let me guess. He was embarrassed, so he got drunk." It was an easy assumption to make. "Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, he humiliated himself even more, although he didn't really care about that at the time." Tom tried not to smirk at this. He would have loved to have seen that hateful man act like a fool. "Not funny, Tom. It was awful," Daphne declared. Tom was suddenly worried at Daphne's serious tone. He definitely shouldn't laugh at something he knew quite well could lead to something terrible. "I'm sorry. What happened next?" he asked hesitantly. Well, in his drunken stupor, he decided to propose to me, Daphne said wryly. Tom felt his jaw stiffen. That sloth of a man marrying Daphne? Tom would gut him first. After that foolishness, I decided I'd better leave the party and go to bed. Tom nodded. Good for her. This morning, Laurel told me what he said to her after I left, and... And? Tom prodded. Daphne shook her head and swallowed hard. It was beyond horrendous, Tom. She and I are going to report him to the police this afternoon. Tom stared blankly at Daphne as he soaked in what all of this meant. He felt his blood run cold. Did he do anything, Daphne? Tom said in a low voice. Daphne shook her head. No, but we're going to report him anyway. Tom nodded. Oh, of course you should. I just want to make sure you tell the police everything. We will, Daphne assured him. Tom stared at Daphne's lovely face a little longer. Did he do or say anything to you, Daphne? Tom asked carefully. Daphne shook her head again. No. Without thinking, Tom grabbed her hand in earnest. Are you sure? To his surprise, Daphne didn't pull away. Yes, I'm positive. This response only made Tom press the issue more. Daphne, just think for another moment. Is there anything at all he said to you that bothered you or worried you? You mean besides his ludicrous drunken proposal? Daphne said disdainfully. Tom scoffed. Yes, besides that. Daphne looked thoughtfully to the sky and watched some flying geese for a moment. Yes, she finally said. Tom felt his entire body stiffen with anxiety as Daphne said nothing else. He looked down at his hand that Daphne was now tightly clutching. He realized this might be something very hard for Daphne to say. You can tell me, he said softly. He came to our room again this morning and... Was he sober? Tom interrupted. Yes, Daphne said. He tried to act apologetic. At first I believed him, but then... Tom patted her hand in encouragement. Daphne was looking at the trees now and appeared almost to be talking to herself. But then I realized I didn't want to be with someone who would ever do something like that, regardless of how handsome or rich he was. Tom felt his jaw tighten again. I told him we needed to go our separate ways, and then he... And then he what? Tom whispered fiercely. Daphne cocked her head. He said he wouldn't give up on me, but the way he said it was like, almost as if he were threatening me. She glanced up at Tom with a concerned look. At that moment, Tom knew David was up to something. Something is not right. Don't ever be alone with him again, Tom warned. Daphne nodded. I'm serious, Daphne. Promise me. I promise. Let me know if he ever says or does anything like that again. Anything at all, and you let me know. I'll come running if you need me. Daphne smiled a small smile. Thank you, Tom. You've always been so good to me. The ache Tom had felt all these months away from Daphne now swelled all the more. And I always will, he promised. Is that all, miss? Yes, thank you, said Daphne to the cashier. She grabbed her apple juice and headed out the door of the gas station. The chime on the door rang and she headed out into the bright light. Hey there, beautiful. Daphne jumped in surprise. There he was, the most handsome devil of a man. You at a gas station with no car? David asked. I just stopped in to get a drink, Daphne said. She wondered why she was standing there answering his question. She should be giving him the cold shoulder and walking away at the very least. Why don't I give you a ride home then? I've got a nice lift, he said, motioning to his sleek red Beamer parked next to them. No thanks, David. It's a nice day. I'll walk. Ah, come on, David complained. Let me be a gentleman. Daphne stared at his blue eyes. Although they were bright in the sunlight, they seemed to have a dark cloud looming over them. He looked as if he were trying to be casual, but his jaw looked stern and mean. His stare didn't leave Daphne's face, and she felt a frightening chill run through her as she remembered Tom's warning. Don't ever be alone with him again. No, thank you, Daphne muttered again as she took a step towards the curb that led into the parking lot. David caught her arm in a hard grip. Daphne grimaced at the sting of it. Don't be that way. Let me get the door for you. He pulled Daphne alongside him to the passenger door of the Beamer. "Let go of me," Daphne said through her teeth. David leaned into Daphne and whispered into her ear. "One thing you need to learn about me, princess," he sneered, tightening his grip on her arm. "I don't take no for an answer." "Until you met me," Daphne said loudly, pushing David with her free hand as hard as she could. At that moment, a man came out of the gas station looking pointedly at the two of them. David took a step back, loosened his grip a bit, and forced his face to be smooth. "Come on, babe, don't take your angst out on me," he chided loudly. Daphne glared at David and turned to the man who had come outside and was walking past them now. "Will you call the police, please?" she yelled. The man raised his eyebrows high. David laughed lightly and rolled his eyes. "All I did was say hi to another girl and she's ready to turn me in," he lied. Daphne opened her mouth to protest, but David gripped her arm again and she grimaced just long enough to give the man enough time to step into his car and drive away. She screamed after him, "Please, call 911! Daphne Zollinger!" "Seriously? He's not going to help me at all?" David smirked at Daphne's shocked expression, and with one great heave he pushed her into the car. Daphne smacked her head on the way in and fell back onto the gear shift. She immediately sat up to get out, but David had already slammed the door shut and locked it. Daphne fumbled to find the lock on the door, but David was already in the driver's seat and driving away. Daphne's head was whirling. What was she going to do? She thought about jumping out of the car, but David was already going 40 miles an hour and speeding up steadily. "You never answered my question, Daphne. I want to marry you." "Oh, shut up," Daphne yelled. David nodded calmly. "I thought you might disagree. I already told you I never take no for an answer. So you are going to accept me, one way or another." Daphne scoffed but said nothing. "You see, Daphne," David said in his smooth voice, "I am one who likes to have everything. And not just money either. In fact, that is why you're going to marry me. I need people to see I care about more than money. Since you're not rich and have a good reputation, everyone will have to agree I care about having a good relationship and a happy family. I won't be like my brother, like your boyfriend accused me. You see, people don't like my brother because they think he's not a good man. People like me, and marrying you will secure that. Now I will be the wealthiest, handsomest, most respected man in all of Brocksville, maybe even beyond. Don't worry, I have enough money to buy me any job I want." Then he let out a maniacal laugh. "It's funny. People claim to have good morals, but once you put a few $1,000 bills into their hands, they will do anything." Daphne was getting angrier and more aggravated by the minute. At the moment, she cursed herself for deciding to pay off her small student loan rather than buying a cell phone. She knew Tom would help her, but she had no way of letting him know. "Besides," David continued, enjoying hearing himself talk, "you're a good girl, and I know you will take care of the kids while I'm off doing whatever I want." Daphne clenched her teeth together. She was going to get away from this scoundrel. "Oh, and by the way, I don't know if you heard," David said. "Laurel dropped her charges against me. She confessed she was just furious and drunk with jealousy, so she accused me falsely." "What?" Daphne gasped under her breath. David laughed greedily. "You're going to do the same thing if you know what's good for you." "I will never do it," Daphne vowed in a quiet voice. "Sure you will," said David as he stopped his car in front of his custom-made home. He turned to her and stared at her darkly. "I know you will." Tom arrived at the police station about 10 minutes after noon. He'd come as quickly as he could after he had worked his first shift at the local hardware store. He knew Daphne was planning on coming around this time, and he hoped he hadn't missed her. He walked up to the front desk and asked for Daphne Zollinger. "Are you here as a witness to her claim?" the lady asked. Well, I could probably help with some details," Tom offered. The lady nodded. "She's in an office with one of our lawyers. I'll take you back." "Thank you," said Tom as he followed her through some winding hallways. They stopped in front of a large office with tall glass walls. The lady knocked at the door and then opened it without waiting for a response. She walked in but didn't shut the door. "Excuse me, Drew. Oh, did your client already leave?" Tom overheard her say. Drew started to answer, but Tom did not hear. He was distracted by a couple of officers walking rapidly past him. The man at the gas station said her name was Daphne Zollinger. She was with someone she apparently didn't trust and begged him to call the police. Tom flipped his head around as he heard Daphne's name. Said they drove off west on Balboa Avenue, the officer continued. I'm sorry, sir, your friend has left already, said the front desk lady. Yeah, said Tom as he pivoted and sprinted out the door. And that concludes Chapter 23. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you come back next time for Chapter 24, which is called Filthy Blood. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I hope you and yours are happy and safe. And if you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.